start to finish. And it will be available on the Duke Law website. We put that on principally for researchers, but if you come into Duke University, Duke Law School website, and then go to my center, the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security, you will see the conference proceedings that you can reach. So if you want to go back and look again at perhaps the panel this morning or presentation that Admiral Blair will be giving shortly, that will be available to you. We don't necessarily market it. We do not want to market it. It's only for educational purposes. But if you want to go back and look at it, it will be available for that. And I think it'll take, what, Eileen, about 4 weeks for us to get it up or something like that. Yeah. We are greatly privileged today to have as our keynoter for our Friday lunch Admiral Dennis Blair. Admiral Blair is a consultant to the Institute for Defense Analysis, and he leads various advisory committees for the Department of Defense. He was senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis from October 2002 until November of 2003, and then was IDA's president from November of 2003 until just a few months ago. He stepped down in January of this year. Of great relevance to why we've asked him to come to our conference to talk to us is he's the former Commander-in-Chief of United States Pacific Command. As a senior U.S. military commander in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, from February 1999 until May of 2002, he led the largest of the unified commands and directed Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force operations across more than 100 million square miles. That's a very big piece of geography, and Admiral Blair had total responsibility for it. During his distinguished 34-year Navy career, Admiral Blair served at sea on guided missile destroyers. He commanded the USS Cochrane, homeported in Yokosuka, Japan. He also commanded Naval Station Pearl Harbor and the USS Kitty Hawk Battle Group, the entire battle group. When not at sea, Admiral Blair served in budget and policy positions on several major Navy staffs, the Joint Staff, and the National Security Council. He was also the first Associate Director of Central Intelligence for Military Support. He's a 1968 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Will, hear this up, Naval Academy. Admiral Blair earned a master's degree in history and languages from Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and served as a White House Fellow at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Admiral Blair has been awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal not once, not twice, but 4 times. He also holds the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal twice and has received decorations from the governments of Japan, Thailand, Korea, and Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very distinguished and very highly recognized retired military officer with a tremendous amount of expertise in the use of military forces and the capability of those forces and the sustainability of those forces. And those are some of the issues that we've asked Admiral Blair to discuss with us today, particularly as it involves ongoing combat operations in Southwest Asia. So with great privilege, I present to you Admiral Blair. Admiral?
No, thanks very much, Scott. It's good to be here. And I saw from your program that most of your conference sessions today talked about these important legal procedural questions about finding, arresting, questioning, and adjudicating terrorist cases. But I'd like to take my time to discuss some of the important basic issues and the components of this entire campaign against terrorism that we've been involved in for at least the past 5.5 years, and actually for years before then. I'd like to talk about whether we have the right strategy, whether we're making progress on the major components of this campaign, and what improvements should we make as we look forward. Now, at the heart of questions of strategy and the strategy of the war on terrorism is what we're talking about. The heart of that is the objective. And is our objective to defeat terrorism, or is it to defeat Muslim Salafist extremist organizations that are using terror tactics to drive the United States out of the Middle East, out of Southeast Asia, in order to overthrow the governments in those regions and establish caliphates, which is their avowed objective. Now, I've heard many specialists, as recently as yesterday in a conference I was attending, dismiss this term war on terrorism, or war on terror. Terrorism, that is the killing of large numbers of people in spectacular fashion in order to achieve political objectives, is a tactic, according to some of these specialists. Calling the current campaign a war on terrorism is like calling World War II a war on tanks. Now, last year, Ashley Tellis, who's a good thinker and strategist at the Carnegie Institute, wrote an assessment of the war on terrorism that took, I think, a deeper look at this question. He pointed out that the phrase and the concept of the war on terrorism added a moral quality to this campaign that's important and valuable. He compared it to the movement against slavery in the 19th century. Now, that was a multi-decade campaign. It wasn't called the war on slavery. It certainly had hard power aspects, military operations conducted by the British Navy against slavers, and certainly by the Northern Army and Navy in the American Civil War. But it had a moral dimension that gave it a staying power that transcended practical operations. It gave it staying power, popular support, energy. And Ashley Tellis came down in favor of the term war on terrorism because it offered the hope that the killing of innocent people for political ends might become obsolete, might be discredited, might be extinct. Another reason to use this more general term of war on terrorism is to prevent the current campaign from becoming a crusade. That is a campaign led by a country with predominantly Christian leadership directed against an extreme form of a single religion, Islam. We can read in this country assertions that Islam is at heart a violent creed, that it's in decline from its former days of glory and is lashing out against Christianity in the West. And there are assertions on the other side in popular Muslim literature that the infidels are enslaving good Muslims, that they are trying to take away its oil. And the temptation to cast this in religion against religion terms is very strong. So what is the right overall objective for this campaign? What's the right term for it? When I think about it, on balance, I come down on the side of calling it a war on terrorism, but within this campaign on prioritizing our efforts against al-Qaeda and other extremist Salafist organizations. However, in order to maintain its important moral authority in this campaign, the United States needs to be consistent in its opposition to organizations that use terrorism, but at the same time, it can't reject legitimate minority grievances and legitimate tactics to right them. And unless we draw this distinction between terrorist tactics and legitimate political objectives pursued by legitimate and legal means, we are going to make a grave mistake. In addition, there are many countries that will attempt to gain our support, rationalize or misuse these terms, war on terrorism, to justify brutal method used against opposition groups of all kinds. The Russians label the Chechen opposition groups terrorists, the Indians, the Kashmiri opposition groups, the Chinese, the Uyghur opposition groups, and then these governments use a wide range of repressive measures against entire populations in the name of their versions of the war on terrorism. Now, in the real world of practical security policy, you can't make the pure moral choice on every single issue. It's more complicated than that. But I believe it's important for the United States in the war on terrorism to be fighting for something more important for the world, not just for protection of American citizens, but fighting for something that makes the world a better place. And it will be a better place if a group with a grievance cannot evoke any sympathy anywhere in the world with planting bombs in marketplaces, flying airplanes into office buildings. The 21st century offers groups with legitimate grievances against governments countless ways that were never open in the past to right those grievances without using terror tactics. There are very sophisticated nonviolent protest tactics, savvy use of the internet, support from non-governmental organizations from outside governments, economic boycotts, infiltration of of governments with sympathizers. The list goes on and on. These are legitimate, effective tactics for those who seek to change their lot in the world, and many of them the United States would want to support. Well, what's the overall assessment of our success in maintaining a moral position of leadership in this campaign? I would say that at best it's a mixed verdict. The President has certainly been very clear that the war against terror is not a war against Islam. He corrected his early use of the term crusade, and he's been quite consistent on this point, which is good. The State Department has a list of terrorist groups and groups that support terrorism, and that's a very even-handed group that uses consistent standards to put a group on the list or a state on the list. However, attempting to justify the invasion of Iraq as part of the war on terrorism has been a setback, I think, in this regard. And the few but widely publicized abuses by American troops that have taken place during that war, such as the Abu Ghraib prison interrogations, reprisal killings that will take place by angry young soldiers or Marines when they're caught in the heat of combat, these have hurt our moral position. And because this war in Iraq promises to dominate at least the remaining 2 years of this administration, it will make it even more difficult to keep focus on the higher ideals of a worldwide campaign against terrorism, which I think is the right overall strategy for this important campaign. But let me turn from these strategic conceptual considerations to some of the more practical components of the war on terrorism, and especially dealing with Al-Qaeda and similar groups, which I think, as I say, the heart of the challenge today. It is they who are the most virulently opposed to the United States, the most ruthless, and as we know, the most dangerous. There are really two different components of this strategy: the security measures here in the United States and the actions that we are taking overseas, and let me talk about them in turn. At home, we've established the Department of Homeland Security, bringing together into one department most of the federal agencies who have responsibilities for protecting American property and citizens. And there have been similar sorts of efforts to increase the effectiveness both at the state level and at the local level, and to have tighter cooperation between private organizations and citizens and the government at all levels. Now, the startup difficulties of the Department of Homeland Security have been reported in the press and are well publicized. When you compare it to other large departments of federal government that the United States has tried to establish recently by combining existing agencies into new departments, you think about the establishment of the Department of Defense in 1947, the establishment of the Department of Energy in the 1970s. By those standards, DHS is not doing too badly. However, it has a very small margin for error. It's learning to try to get itself organized while it's doing an important job, and it's under crisis conditions. It's trying to establish more integrated procedures between and among organizations that have been bureaucratic rivals in the past, at worst, at best, quite separate. It's trying to put in new communication networks to establish standalone legacy systems that the departments and agencies brought along with them. It's trying to staff new offices, deal with congressional oversight requirements, and all the time Al-Qaeda is planning and attempting to repeat the 9/11 attacks in even more spectacular fashion. Now, the U.S. system of government, of course, purposefully tolerates inefficiency and duplication of authorities in order to minimize the chances for concentration and abuse of power, but they may have overdone it a little bit in this case. And so it's not really surprising that there's a great deal of bumping and grinding as these formerly independent agencies and departments are brought together under one department with a very tough mission. And in addition, security against terrorism is not the only mission of DHS. Secretary Chertoff ruefully said at one point after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita that he thought he was going to spend his time as Secretary of Homeland Security catching terrorists, and he'd found that there are a lot of other things that he had to do. And then there's the very difficult issue which raises important constitutional concerns of striking this balance between individual privacy on the one hand and gathering intelligence on potential terrorist attacks on the other hand. Most of the agencies which are now forming the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the Justice Department and FBI, which have a key role here, come from law enforcement backgrounds. That is, their job has always been to prosecute those who break the law, to convict them in courts, with all of the constitutional restrictions on gathering of evidence, the rights of defendants in trials, and getting a court conviction. And of course, the big idea has been that a small number of successful prosecutions will deter the potential criminals who are out there and haven't been caught. Now, when you take these domestic law enforcement agencies and give them the job of preventing crimes before they happen by identifying and watching those who might perpetrate them and arresting them just before they commit a crime, when you look at the history of that, the results have not been very good. The measures taken against suspected communists and communist sympathizers in the 1950s, against Vietnam protesters in the 1960s, are generally judged to have resulted in more abuses to the rights of innocent citizens than they prevented damage against the United States. So it's on this legacy that we are turning to this new set of missions. And we're in the midst of working out the right balance to this set of issues one more time. But the stakes, I would say, are higher. The 3,000 people who died on September 11th, 2001 show that this threat is not theoretical. The technology of surveillance is more pervasive. Telephone records, travel records, financial records that are held both in government databases and in private company databases. These contain information on American citizens that either singly or put together is the type of information that has traditionally been private in this country. Now, polling data indicates that most Americans are willing to cede a greater portion of their privacy than they have in the past in return for better protection against terrorist attacks. However, they also want the laws and the policies to govern this approved by Congress. They want recourse if their names show up mistakenly on terrorist watch lists. They want safeguards so that the data that is gathered will not be misused. And they're unwilling to trust the executive branch to act secretly in what it believes is best for the interests of the citizens without checking with them and with their elected representatives. So what's my overall assessment of this defensive aspect of the war on terrorism? I would say it's generally positive, but still with an awfully long way to go. Department of Homeland Security is established. It's improving every day. Important issues of privacy are being worked out by all three branches of the federal government, and we actually have thwarted planned attacks against this country in the last 5.5 years. And let me turn to the final area, the one which I'm most personally familiar, which is the overseas component of the war on terrorism. On 9/11, I was Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Command, and like the other regional military commanders, I immediately formed a plan and took action against the terrorist threats that were in my area of responsibility. In that case, as Scott Silliman mentioned, the area that goes from the west coast of Africa across Asia to the west coast of the United States. Now, in the part of the world that I was responsible for, there were no Afghanistans. There were no countries that, as a matter of official policy, were harboring terrorist organizations that were planning and conducting attacks against the United States. There was no country that officially thought terrorism was a good idea and that terrorism against the United States was a good idea. We divided up the countries in our region according to two criteria. First, whether they were willing to take action against terrorist organizations within their borders, and second, whether they had good capabilities to do so. We call this the willing and able scale. For example, Singapore was both willing and able. The Philippines were willing, but fell well short in terms of their capabilities. Indonesia at that time, and this was before the Bali bombing occurred in Indonesia, was capable, but was not willing. It did not think that it was subject to terrorist threat, and was not, therefore didn't have any incentive to take action. So the major thrust of our efforts was to work with the military and other security forces of the region to combat terrorist groups within their borders. The practical measures that we worked on were sharing of intelligence, coordination of action against suspected groups, building of technical capabilities, especially cooperative technical capabilities, training of personnel. And I can give you an early successful example of how this worked, which occurred shortly after September of 2001. In about November of 2001, U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan had captured a video which showed a handheld camera being taken around Singapore, taking pictures of key locations, and the narration on the video was here's a place where Americans come together. Here's a bike stand right next to it. We could probably get about 300 pounds of explosive into this bike stand, and if we did it at the right time, we could kill a lot of them. And it was narrated in clearly a Singaporean accent, and it was clear that something was afoot in Singapore. The U.S. Special Forces who captured this video turned it over to U.S. intelligence services, who went to their counterparts in Singapore, showed it to them, and said, this is what we found out, what's going on in your country. Singaporean security services said, oh yes, we've been watching that group of people, and we've been wondering whether it was time to arrest some of them or not. At that time, the USS Vinson Naval Battle Group was on its way back from being part of the war in Afghanistan and was due to spend the Christmas holidays in port in Singapore. Big problem. So we talked about it with the government of Singapore and came up with a combined plan in which Singaporeans would, in about the middle part of December, arrest a bunch of members of this group, and we would have the Vinson Battle Group come and make the port call that they had planned to do. The plan went through. The information that came from interrogating the people who were arrested was fed back to U.S. and passed around. Improvements were made. The port visit was made successfully. So this was, I think, an excellent example of the sorts of both cooperation across our own government, because the State Department, as well as intelligence agencies and the Department of Defense, were all involved in it, and certainly the international organization. However, as I think back about that incident in retrospect, it really was due to an unusually favorable set of circumstances. In October, November of 2001, everybody was up on the step. There was tremendous energy in working against terrorism and working together. There was a strong sense of urgency that drove cooperation within our government. And in addition, we were dealing with a government in which there were established means of communications and traditions of cooperation which could be very effective in those circumstances. The real challenge for the future is to establish the authorities and practices that will make that kind of swift, effective action routine for the different departments of government that operate overseas: defense, state, the intelligence agencies, the FBI. Make that the norm and rather than the exception, and extend those same characteristics to our cooperation with other governments who have the same goals that we do in this area. International terrorist groups are small, flexible. They go right across international borders, and they go across the jurisdictional boundaries of the various branches of our government. We are sort of big and muscle-bound and clumsy, and there's a mismatch there in terms of them being able to move around and conduct these acts which we've all seen. I'll give you another example that happened a few months later while I was still Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command, to illustrate how it doesn't work. We were watching the intelligence that was coming on terrorist organizations, and it appeared that there was a terrorist cell that was moving up into Northeast Asia towards Japan, Korea, and another one moving into Southeast Asia across Indonesia. And although your intelligence is never perfect, the idea seemed that there was going to be a couple of attacks in two parts in Asia as sort of a spectacular demonstration of extending the terrorist reach there. I sent out a message to the ambassadors in the countries that I thought would be affected, and to the heads of the intelligence services in those countries. Interestingly, it took me 3 different communication systems to send out the single message. That was lesson number 1. I suggested that the ambassadors talk to their host countries, see if they had similar information and whether things ought to be toughened up in terms of host country actions. I suggested that the intelligence chiefs talk to their counterparts, again, to compare notes and to see if any joint action was warranted. I only received one reply to that message from some junior official in the State Department who said I'd exceeded my authority by sending those messages. No other action. As it turned out, the Nothing happened in Northeast Asia, and a few months later, this Bali bombing did happen in Southeast Asia. So we were onto something, but we didn't know what it was. But the real lesson for me was the inability of the United States government to get organized in an effective, integrated way in order to move quickly in the face of a quick threat. But this residual insistence on institutional prerogatives, who can tell whom what to do, whose money is being spent, who gets the credit, who gets the blame, that just gets in the way of an effective response to an organization that is buying tickets using the internet, sending things UPS, and moving around really quickly in small groups in ways that can do us a lot of damage. Now, for about the last year, several of us who have this feeling that we just aren't integrated enough in our national security activities have united in something called the Project on National Security Reform, and I'm going to take advantage of my time here to plug that effort, because our objective is nothing less than a major revision of the National Security Act of 1947, which is the underlying legislative authority that divides us into a Department of Defense and a Department of State and a Director of Central Intelligence. Specifies it. That's how the money is allocated. That's how the money is spent. That's how the authorities take place. It's a structure that was very useful when the nation's problems divided up neatly into diplomatic problems, military problems, intelligence problems, and other problems. It doesn't really have the flexibility that we need today for combating terrorism, and certainly for many other of the tough challenges that we face in the national security region, whether they be dealing with failing states, combating proliferation of nuclear weapons, dealing with narcotics. These don't fall neatly into these institutional arrangements that were made in 1947, and we think it needs change, and we think that a updated piece of legislation will provide that. So we just need to do a better job of integrating the efforts to use all of the power that we have. Zat Silliman mentioned the role of the military forces, and I believe that the military forces have the resources they need to do the proper part of this job against terrorism, but they don't have the resources to do all of the jobs that are being put on them, because we don't have the institutional capability in other agencies and the organization to be able to use it effectively, whether it's the capabilities of reconstruction in a country like Iraq, capabilities for public diplomacy in other parts of the world, and the many things that need to be done. We've got to integrate it better, have everybody doing the job that they are suited for, that they know how to do in order to be effective. Now, in addition to this organizational challenge for combating terrorism with our national security organizations, there is the challenge of there is the problem of dealing with the ideological challenge of fundamentalist Muslim organizations. Polling data and expert advice tells us that most Muslims do not support these extreme terrorist groups. How can we support majority Muslim moderate opinion, isolate the extremist groups, and undercut their ability to raise money, to gain jihadist volunteers, and to evoke sympathy for their barbaric acts? The short answer is, of course, very carefully. Crude attempts to do so with rhetoric or money are counterproductive. The public rhetoric from the United States has to be just right. Much more needs to be done quietly and skillfully on the internet, for example, which is now the most effective communication mechanism that's used by these extremist violence groups, in ways that will support moderate Muslim organizations without tagging them with being U.S. stooges, in supporting those who are working on revising the curriculum taught at madrasas. And American actions in this area have to be taken in a smart manner, not characterized as information operations, a buzzword in the Department of Defense these days, public relations, which you often hear is an American core competence, or propaganda, which is what a lot of it is. But it has to be done in a way that makes clear that this is support for groups that share our ideals of toleration, increasing individual prosperity, and progress. So what's my assessment of this third area, the overseas area of the war on terrorism? I would say that it's the worst of the three that I mentioned. Although there are pockets of individuals from the Department of State, Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security that are working together in limited areas in a flexible, effective, timely manner. I would say they are the exception. The general authorities, funding, procedures, and results that we have are stovepipe, slow, and not very effective. We're muscle-bound and ineffective in areas where our opponents are small and nimble. And we're only saved by the fact that we're so big and so powerful that even though we're clumsy, we can get the job done. And the important work of supporting moderate Muslim organizations and individuals who have both the authority and the means to isolate extremist groups, those efforts so far have been generally clumsy and not very effective. I happen to end my evaluation of 3 areas on a pessimistic note, but I don't want to leave you with an overall message from my remarks that's pessimistic, so let me correct it by putting it in context. This war on terrorism in which we're engaged is new, it's difficult, and it's important for the country. And to wage it effectively, we have to create entirely new structures and relationships within our government and with other countries, and between our government and private citizens, as we talked about, and between our government and private organizations and companies. We're addressing real constitutional issues here. This is not something that you just snap off an executive order and things happen. They have to be worked out in accordance with our traditions. For a large country like the United States, this is not the work of a couple of weeks and a few speeches and a few executive orders. It's a work of years. And those of us who have worked in this organization and close to others know that there are thousands of skilled and dedicated Americans, both inside the government and outside of it, who are seeking the right answers for the long term. Meanwhile, they're working against terrorist groups every day. And knowing these people, knowing their dedication, I think we're going to get it right. My frustration is that we have to get it fast also. So thank you very much. Let me take any questions that we might have.
Sir, we've got a few moments for some questions.
Sure.
Would you entertain any questions? Go ahead, Laura.
Many thanks for that terrific and thought-provoking speech. One of the points you raise is the challenge posed by fragmentation of the government agencies responsible for combating terrorism. And you mentioned, you sort of touched on this in your last remark. Now that we're outsourcing and privatizing many military intelligence gathering structures, that adds there's an added dimension there to that organization problem. I wonder if you could comment a bit on the challenges that privatization poses and sort of what you see as some way forward there. The challenges to command authority, for example, in the field, the contractors not involved in.
Right. I'm very much in favor of contracting out specific functional tasks outside the government. But unfortunately, in many cases, we contract out our brains too. I mean, there's certainly there's some inherently governmental functions, and the government employees who supervise the out-contracting agencies have to be good and experienced, know what's going on, know what to expect, know how much to pay for it, keep an eye on it when it's going wrong. And I think in the press of events, too many people have simply said, write a contract and then go on to the next job, instead of realizing that you have to supervise. Contractors are, in almost all cases, very good, dedicated people. Many of them retired government officials who know what's going on the inside. But there's an inescapable difference of incentive and reward in that you just can't count on personality to overcome. So I think in the rush to contract, we've also lost control of contract supervision, and things like that you describe, and contractors running loose in a war zone without any regulations as to what their discipline status is and what their legal status is. That's part of that. If you had strong contracting officers within the government who realize that before you let a contract, there are certain key things you have to do, including the legal status of the contractees, how you measure the effectiveness, when you terminate it, when you get better ones. You beat okay. We're kind of inventing these things after the fact when something bad happens, rather than thinking it through ahead of time and saving ourselves the trouble. So I just think it is, under the press of events, the difference in what's going on, it's gone too far, and we need to reel back in the inherently government functions. And we also have to pay attention to the qualifications of the people who are doing it in government. In the armed forces, and there are a bunch of people in uniform here in our group, we spend an awful lot of time worrying about the education and training of people at various phases, and we pull people off the line in Iraq to go to college, war colleges, because we think it's important. I see nothing comparable in the non-military professional development parts of our government. A person assigned a job, learns on the job, did it pretty well, so maybe gets promoted to the next one without the benefit of taking this time to really study the profession and to learn on it as we go. So I think to solve the contractor problems that we have, we need to work internally in government.
Admiral, can I ask one question before I turn to the others?
Yeah.
Secretary Gates, as you know, just made the determination that the tours will be 15 months rather than 12. We've got members of our National Guard, active duty, reserve, now going back for a second and a third time.
Right.
Our equipment is deteriorating because it's not getting the maintenance. How long can we go on before we try to try some other approach, before we exhaust our young men and women, and before all our equipment is no longer usable?
I'm not on the inside of that of those discussions anymore. I can tell you that when we really had a broken armed forces in my background, which was in the Vietnam War, that was here, and where we are now is here. So we are certainly not in the position we were in the late 1960s and 70s, when drug problems and was rife in the armed forces. Retention rates were virtually zero. Everybody got out. So I don't think we're at the panic stage yet. But nonetheless, I think we have reached the limits of what the current structure of the armed forces can sustain over the long term. In my Navy, the action we took when these long tours in Vietnam really had an effect on the armed forces. A deployment was supposed to be 6 months. It was never 6 months. It was kind of 8 months if you were lucky, and then those last 2 months, you'd be watching the battle group that was supposed to come relieve you, and every time there was a hiccup there, you had another month added on, 9, 10. And it was this uncertainty that was corrosive. You planned to be home by Thanksgiving. You were going to miss Thanksgiving and Christmas and on into New Year's, and that was what I think really corroded at the hearts. And the Navy solved it in those years by the Chief of Naval Operations setting a time saying, except if it's World War III, a battle group is going to go for 6 months, not only a battle group, but an amphibious ready group, the other deploying parts of the Navy. And when it comes home, it's going to spend a year home, and then it can go again, and our people can count on that, and they can plan accordingly. And we were able to hold to it. And we just realized that there's a finite amount of deployable power that you get from the base of power that you build. The Army and the Air Force had a different tradition. Their tradition was to fight big wars when they happen. The Marine Corps was sort of like was closer to the Navy. But the Army, and to a lesser extent the Air Force, would be in their peacetime garrison positions. Then they would, when a war happened, their tradition was to go fight for the duration, then to come home and get ready. And they're now caught in this position. They haven't really developed this idea of how much of a base do they have versus how much they can deploy. So they're working that out. And I think there is a limit, and we're figuring out what that limit is. So if I'm not going to put a number on how many years, but it ain't 10. And how many more years can we do this? It's probably more than one, but it's probably somewhere in that vicinity before we have to do something major. And I think this realization that you can win wars with fewer forces than you can occupy countries and make the right thing happen over time is something that's fairly new to us that we have to work out.
Thanks, sir. Warren?
Reservations, sir, about the desirability of bringing all these different groups together under Homeland Security. It seems to me, I understand that you're making things more efficient and there are other advantages, but if you're fighting this nimble, small group, and instead of having competing intelligence agencies and so forth that have some efficiencies but may uncover different things, now if you bring them all under one umbrella, it may be the opposite of unleashing some Jack Bowers or something that are going to go off and fight their own wars, or special forces trained to go after that and not have to report back to the headquarters.
Justifiable concern, and you know what you'd like to have is the best of both. What you'd like to have is that the skills and knowledge that can be developed in one area can be spread quickly to others, and that they can go on and then make advances in their own ways and feed that back. You don't want to get, you're right, just a least common denominator. Everybody just waits around to do that. I generally count on the intelligence, enterprise, and orneriness of Americans to guard us against that. Most people I know in the Coast Guard or Customs or Border don't like to just sit around and wait to be told. They're out trying new things. So I think in general, the idea of trying to get reporting systems that can talk to each other, the ability to communicate and be on and have the opportunity on one team to share strengths is a good thing. And there are some simple duplicative items that we need to knock out. So I think most of the risks are on the other side of lack of coordination right now, but we could go too far and be subject to what you suggest.
One last question, Professor Kirk.
Sir, you referred briefly to the disparity between the way that on the civilian side they are educated regarding these types of issues, and on the military side. I'd like to get your assessment of this. I think that we're in a position in which we're facing a generational challenge. That is, in those areas, especially in the Middle East and some of the other areas, it's the next generation that's being taught in madrasas, those extremist ideas and so forth, and some of them, not all of them. And so that's an issue that our next generation of leaders, young men and women now, that's going to be taking with them. They're taking your place now to get money now. But how do we deal with that situation? Because I'm not quite convinced, other than some of the previous attempts to deal with that civilian side of the coin by allowing State Department people and so forth to go to, say, the National War College or the Air War College. Do you foresee, for example, any changes in the curriculum at the war colleges, both Navy, Army, and Air Force, and National War College, that will deal with this next generation of military leaders that will have to face this problem in this long war? And any suggestions about public diplomacy or other areas in which we can attempt to deal with and counteract that negative influence in the Islamic world, where you have these madrasas and so forth.
Right. I had that question when I was chairing a group that reviewed the core curriculum of the Naval Academy for Admiral Rempt. And our recommendation, which certainly reflected my views, was that really starting at the midshipman level, every midshipman should be required not to learn a language fluently perhaps, but to have an area study concentration of some sort. My experience is if you learn one different country or region pretty well, that skill is transferable to other countries because you respect what it is you don't know. When I was growing up in the Navy, I learned Russian and I knew the Russians pretty well. They were the enemy. I found when I went out to the Pacific and had to deal with 41 countries that I hadn't studied and whose language I didn't speak, the mindset I had of trying to understand another country stood me in good stead in dealing with them, and I would call for an expert who knew those countries. I don't think I would have done that had I not realized from my study of one country that it's different and it makes a difference. You know, you can say no, yes, and you have to understand which of those two do you believe when you're talking to a Japanese, the head or the voice, and there were numerous times there when the cultural and regional knowledge aspect of a country was absolutely vital, and at least I knew enough to call somebody who knew. I was just talking with Melissa, who was in the Army in Iraq, and I'm sure she would say she found the same thing, that understand that you just can't go to a meeting, pass a list, come to a quick agreement and sign it off means that anything will happen in northern Iraq. There are numerous cups of tea to be drunk, and you have to find out who the real person is who's in charge, not the person who has the title mayor, and how people make commitments and how you can check to see if something's happened. I mean, I think all of that is more and more going to be a required not only military officer skill, which is what we're talking about, but of all people involved in national security. And I don't know any other way to do it except to learn one of them pretty well and then to apply that as you learn others. So that would be my recommendation. And I'm hopeful. I mean, my kids and grandkids are much more internationally minded than I was. There's more travel. The internet goes more widely. It's part of their consciousness, I think, in a way that was unusual in my generation. So I think we can do it.
Admiral Blair, we thank you for your time. You came all the way down here just to do this, and so we very much appreciate your coming to join our conference, Admiral Blair. So join me in thanking Admiral Blair for giving me please take that, all within the ethics rules and everything. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
We will, in great deference of an old Air Force officer to a much senior Navy Admiral, we're obviously running about 15 minutes late, so at 2:30 we'll reconvene back there for our last panel of the conference on military commissions.